Salman Rushdie, one of the central characters in 2 years, 8 months, and 28 nights is Geronimo Menezes. He's a gardener, a somewhat lonely widower, and as it turns out, part genie. Where did he come from in your imagination?
Well, first of all, he came from my hometown. You know, and he, like me, came from Bombay. He came from a very different Bombay than I did. He came from a neighborhood called Bandra, which is famously a Christian neighborhood. And he's actually the illegitimate child of a Catholic priest. Sorry, Pope. You know, obviously this never happens in real life. Anyway, so he comes from this other part of my hometown, but at a similar time to when I was growing up there. And he eventually ends up in New York and becomes a landscape gardener. He was really the first thing I had of the book, because there's a strange thing that happens to him, which is he wakes up one morning and he discovers that his feet can't touch the ground, that he's like half an inch off the ground. And initially I thought it would be a book about him. This would be a kind of sort of Kafkaesque nightmare story about an ordinary person to whom an extraordinary, inexplicable thing happens. And how does he face the consequences of it? You know, like Gregor Samsa turning into the giant insect.
Where did levitation come from?
Well, because
he's a gardener and is
with
close to the earth? Or?
I mean, well, you know, for me, the issue of ground that you stand on has always been very important because of me having had this life bouncing around the planet. You know, so I've always found as a writer that place, that literally the ground beneath the feet of the characters, you know, I have to make that up before I can put the characters on it, and then I can start writing about them. So I spend a lot of time thinking about that. And I thought this was obviously a kind of metaphor of disconnection, of alienation, or whatever. And I thought how poignant if he were somebody who spent his whole life caring for the earth, you know, nurturing it and the things that grow out of it. You know. If that person were to find himself suddenly detached from the earth that was his life, you know, I thought it would be sort of sad and funny at the same time, in the same way as Kafka's giant insect is sad and funny at the same time. So that's where it started, and I really thought it might just be a novel about him. And then I started asking myself, why did that happen? How did it happen? And suddenly this whole fairy tale thing exfoliated from him. And the whole book came out of him, really.
Geronimo, whose full name is Raphael Hieronymus, is, as you were saying, an immigrant to New York. And like you, he's originally from Bombay, now known as Mumbai. And he dreams of being able to return to India, where he imagines he'll feel at home. And the Jinnah, the Princess Dunya, creates that possibility for him. Could you read a little from 2 years, 8 months, 28 nights?
Yeah, this is a moment at which they've met, obviously, and she has listened to his heart and thinks she knows what he wants, which is to go home again. And so she kind of creates it for him. His feet were on the ground now, but where was this ground? In fairyland or Bombay or an illusion? It was just another way of being adrift or in the clutches of the Jinnah princess. As he looked around at the dream of an old street scene, this occult hologram, he was in the grip of everything sad that ever happened to him. He wished he had never become detached from the place he was born, wished his feet had remained planted on that beloved ground, wished he could have been happy all his life in those childhood streets and grown into an old man there and known every paving stone, every betel nut vendor's story, every boy selling pirated novels at traffic lights, every rich man's car rudely parked up on the sidewalk, every girl at the bandstand aging into a grandmother and remembering when they kissed furtively at night in the churchyard. He wished he could have roots spreading under every inch of his lost soil, his beloved lost home, that he could have been a part of something, that he could have been himself walking down the road not taken, living a life in context and not the migrant's hollow journey that had been his fate. Ah, but then he would never have met his wife, he argued with himself, and that deepened his grief. How could he bear the idea that by remaining joined to the line of the past, he might never have had his one true passage of joy? Maybe he could dream her into his Indian life. Maybe she would have loved him there as well. She would have walked down this street and found him here and loved him just the same, even though he would have been the self he never became. Maybe she would have loved that self too, Raphael Hieronymus Menezes, that lost boy, that boy which the man had lost. I thought you'd like it, said the little girl with the genies eyes, puzzled. I listened to your heart and heard your sorrow at what you had left behind, and I thought this would be a welcome gift. Take it away, he said, choking on his tears.
Salman Rushdie reading from his novel.
Well, you know, that idea that you can't go home again is, I mean, it's true of many of us. I think, you know, it's because the home, the thing that felt like home, no longer, it's not like that anymore. You know, you go back there, it's not like that anymore. And so it's not just that you can't get on a plane and go there. It's that if you go there, it's not as it was. And you know, the past is lost not just as a place, but also as a time.
But your own early life has certain parallels to Geronimo's. And what do you imagine it might have looked like had you not left India at 13 for boarding school in England? If you had lived a life in context, as he says.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it would have been very different. Maybe I'd never have written a book. You know, I mean, maybe I'd have had to work in my father's textile factory. I didn't want to do that, you know. I don't know, it was that's a generation, you know, those days. It was very hard to have a literary life in India because there was just no way to earn any money doing it. So you either had to have personal wealth or another job and write as a hobby in your spare time, or you know, live with your parents. And I didn't really want to do any of those. I didn't have the money, and I didn't want to have another job, and didn't want to live with my parents anymore. So I had to try and be a writer in England, where there was a way of making a living as a writer. You know, and now it's very different. I mean, now there actually is a very rich literary life in India, and I think if I were a writer of this younger generation, it would never have been necessary for me to leave. So I could have just stayed there and done the thing I wanted to do. So there we are. I mean, as I say, you can't complain. Life is what it is.
But you give Geronimo a certain wistfulness.
Yeah, there is a sense of loss, and I think he shares that with me. Yes, I think. And but I think all of us, you know, one of the things I wanted to do is to suggest that all of us, you know, if we're not 15, we've all lost things. You know, we've all lost things we loved, or people we loved, or homes we loved, or whatever. You know, so. And we carry that with us. And one of the things that he does, and I think people do, is you try to find something that will fill the hole, you know, something the same shape as the hole. And so, you know, he's lost his wife. I mean, that wasn't in the passage, but, you know, the woman he loved dies. And then he sees in the Jinn princess something that feels like her, you know, and I think maybe we do sometimes fall in love with people because they fill the gap left by the person we used to love. And they feel like the same person, but they're not, of course. And so then we make the next mistake.
In your novel, a devastating storm has hit New York City. This is in relatively contemporary to us, our period now. I mean, it's not back in the 12th century. We're back in the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it as like, I think of the novel as being set like the day after tomorrow.
Yeah.
You know?
And Geronimo, that's when he finds that his feet don't quite touch the ground. Human lightning strikes become more frequent. An orphan baby can mysteriously identify liars and cheats. How do the citizens understand these strange occurrences?
Well, I mean, what happens is that people are obliged to accept that the world has become strange, that these things called the strangenesses, which are random destructions of the natural order, you know, where things like an error in the law of gravity, in the location of one person, and all these other manifestations, and they're bewildered and frightened, and I wanted just to give this sense of a world in which the rules didn't seem to work anymore, and I mean, I think I sometimes have that sense, about living in a time where the rate of change is so great, and the way in which things are developing is so, in many ways unlikable and dark, so that you feel that you don't know how things work, you don't know what the game is anymore. And I thought, how do I write a story about that? And that's where the jinn came in order to create the disruptions.
But is that a function of age? Because I remember, back in 1992, you told me the world is operatic and surreal and grotesque.
Yeah, but that's my point of view. I mean, many other people see the world as being humdrum, everyday, and tedious, and that's just their problem. It seems to me.
Though when you talk about there being no rules or the rate of change.
What I'm saying is, if you're used to the world being humdrum, everyday, and tedious, and suddenly there are giant serpents coiled around the Chrysler Building, it would be a shock. It would be disturbing. And so, I mean, the serious thing is, one of the things I always liked a lot about the ideas underlying the surrealists, is that the surrealists believed that that habituation, getting used to the everyday, places a kind of, it has a kind of dulling effect on our vision. So we see the world through the habituation of the everyday, and it means that we fail to notice that the world is extraordinary and wonderful. And their idea was to use techniques, whether in painting or literature or film or whatever, use techniques which stripped away that habituation, that everydayness, the banality with which we see the world, so that we could again see the world as marvelous and extraordinary, And so to have something very radically bizarre happening in an ordinary city in an ordinary way, on an ordinary day, is a way of disrupting everybody's experience of the everyday. And then they have to really think about what's going on.
And it's interesting because you ascribe literary or artistic creations to the influence of jinn, works by Ionesco or Beckett, Magritte, Gogol, Buñuel. I mean,
there's a little homage to the surrealists there, yeah. I mean, I think, writing is not just influenced by, writing is partly influenced by life, and it's partly influenced by books, but it can be influenced by anything, and I think, I've always been a colossal movie buff, and I think when I was young and at university and watching movies obsessively all the time, some of the films that most affected me were the ones which used surrealist techniques. And I think, in particular, filmmakers like Fellini and Buñuel. I thought that was a wonderful way to tell a story. And it maybe chimed in me, I think largely unconsciously, with these wonder tales I'd heard, as a young person. And so I've always responded to that way of telling stories. Yes, there's a moment in the book when there's a paragraph, when kind of every famous surrealist text
or absurdist or something like that.
Absurdist text enters the storyline. Yeah. People turn into rhinoceroses.
Exactly.
I was in that play at Cambridge. That's one reason.
Is that it? Oh.
I was in
the
Ionesco's play, Rhinoceros. I had to turn into a rhinoceros. Not easy to do, especially on a student budget.
The dark jinn and the bright jinn, AKA the good guys and the bad guys, they both try to control or influence humans, and the dark jinn's whispers seem to have, are in the ascendant, so to speak. Isn't there a problem here if humans are motivated by benevolent or malevolent spirits, if good and evil are external to people?
Yeah, there is a problem, but it's a way of telling a story, and I don't think that good and evil are external, and actually there's a moment in the book where it's suggested that the jinn can be understood as aspects of our own darker selves, that they can be understood as, and I would sometimes think about them as kind of the id made actual. It's a story, Eleanor.
I know. But there are, I mean, it's a story that can be received at many levels.
What I'm saying is that the jinn unleash things in people which are perhaps there to be unleashed. And so yes, it's also about the nature of the people. But there are also acts of possession, and I do think one of the things that happens in the world, is that people are possessed by whatever power, by ideologies, by religions, by whatever, which pushes them to behave in appalling ways, and that is a kind of thing that comes at them from the outside and takes them over. And I think we see it every day right now, and so it's about all of that, but really it's just a fairy tale and should be understood as fairy tales are, which is it tells truth by coming at it from sideways. It's not telling, the jinn aren't real,
In 2 years, we see the collision of belief systems, of stories. I mean, it's destructive, but some form of society manages to survive. And we hear the voice of his descendants a millennium later. Religion is gone, the society seems peaceful, contented, but the citizens have lost the capacity to dream. Is that so bad? I mean, are we talking about real dreams at night, or metaphorical visions, as in I have a dream, or what's been lost?
Doesn't say.
I know, I'm asking you. Sorry, you're here.
But there's a reason why it doesn't say, which is that I don't want to tell you. No, I mean, I wanted, the book, in fact, one of the things that allowed me to give the book the manner that I wanted for it, the tone of voice I wanted for it, was this idea I had, which again wasn't part of the original thinking, but it emerged, that the narrative point of the book would be 1,000 years in the future. So that somebody, an individual or a group, 1,000 years in the future, would look back at us now in the way that if we were to look back 1,000 years to the year 1000, what we would have there is a mixture of history and legend and half-truth and just outright make-believe, I mean, 1,000 years ago is what? Charlemagne, kind of, and Charlemagne's a historical figure, but it's also, roughly speaking, the time which would have been King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And did they even exist? So you have this mixture of history and myth. And I thought, well, if these people of the future are looking at us and they have this mixture of half-remembered facts and legends that have got into the historical record, etc., it would allow me, the book, to have this half-real, half-not-real flavor. And then I thought, who are these people in the future, And one of the things I wanted to do was to not write the obvious dystopic fantasy. Not to say, the world is terrible, and then it gets worse, and it ends badly. And just don't do that, because it's boring. So I thought, how else can I imagine if we are still around 1,000 years from now, what might we be like? Who might we have become? And so I suggested this kind of optimistic future in which religion has faded away and reason is triumphant and so on, but then it's not perfect, and no such thing as a free lunch is, I guess, what I'm saying. Or in the classic language of the fairy tale, be careful what you wish for. I mean, one of the things about asking the jinn for wishes is that you have to be very precise. Otherwise you find yourself, curiously not where you want to be. I mean, there's a joke in the novel about what all men ask the jinn for. You know, all men ask the jinn for infinite wealth, unlimited power, and a bigger sexual organ. Because the enormous unimaginativeness of the male wishing mind. But, you know, all of those things can go wrong. You know? I mean, you know, there's a limit to this enlargement of the sexual organ for it to be even useful. So
Clearly, you've been thinking about this too much.
Well, what I'm saying is at the end of the book, I wanted to suggest that even if the world is going to become or could become this calmer, more rational, more peaceful place that we all hope that it might be, that there might still be something wrong with that. As in, it might be boring, or just dull, or some quality of fantasy or imagination might have leached out of it with too much reason. And so just that, I just thought, you know, if I've just got a completely happy ending, that's sort of sappy. And I thought I've got to throw some vinegar in there. So that's it. The vinegar is that, you know, it's good, but it ain't that good. So it's a sort of happy but. So it ends on that but, deliberately. That's why I'm not answering the question, because I've actually had a friend of mine who read it when I first finished it, and she was really annoyed. She said, "How can you end there?" I said, "Well, because that's where I wanted to end." And she said, "No, that's completely awful. I want to know what those people are like." So, I don't know, maybe I write a sequel. My son, who's now 18, but when he was reading Harry Potter and all that, he said to me one day, quite seriously, he said, "Dad, don't write novels, write series." And, you know, he's right, the kid's right. Economically speaking, he's right.